Perfect. Shall we get started?
Yeah.
I think so. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone who's joined us. This was originally planned to be our first in-person event of the year, but we all live online now and it seems to work well for our group in particular because of the geographical spread. So it's nice for everyone to be with us. Thank you very much to Jill and to Shona for sharing some insight on what I think is very interesting and still relevant issue for small organisations. Despite everything that's happening at the moment, the challenges we're all facing, we've still got the day-to-day work to consider. And although for a lot of us it's keeping our heads above water at the moment, the need for longer-term strategy and planning is still there. So this is a really good chance to focus on those challenges. We're recording the session today. We've got a poll, I think, as part of the session, and questions can be put in the chat box anytime throughout, and I think we'll be having some time maybe during and certainly at the end for questions. So any questions as we go along, pop them in the chat box. I don't think there's anything else housekeeping wise, so I think I'll hand over to Shona and Jill.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks, Gemma. Okay, well, I'll start, and I am just going to do a little bit of background to us, the Kambia Appeal, a potted history, if you like. Very happy to take any questions. So if you could, yes, we are the Kambia Appeal. Freddie, if you could just put the map slide up, the next one. So a little geography lesson for those of you that don't know. Sierra Leone's where we work, and that's the country highlighted there in yellow with the star. Freetown is the capital, and Sierra Leone is made up of 12 districts, and the Kambia is one of those districts. It's in the north, it borders Guinea, and that's where we get our name from, the Kambia Appeal. We were founded in 1992. You can put the next slide up if you want, Freddie. Our focus is on reproductive and maternal health. We have links to our local NHS trust. Two of our trustees are retired obstetricians. One is a GP and one is a current paediatrician, so very much clinical background. When we started back in '92, we were very much grassroots fundraising organisation. We did bake sales and raffles, and that money was used to send equipment to Kambia with occasional visits from the UK as well. Many of you will know there was a civil war in Sierra Leone, ended in 2002. Obviously during that period we were inactive. The hospital in Kambia was burned down. But when the war ended, we got back up and running again. And I suppose the change from us from moving from that grassroots fundraising organisation to an organisation managing larger projects and larger grants came with our first major grant, which was back in 2010. Where we received a grant from the British Council under their International Health Links funding scheme. And that was to fund short-term specialist teaching trips, which saw NHS staff from Gloucestershire doing skills sharing in Kambia with Kambia hospital staff. They were short-term specialist teaching trips. And from there on, we grew, and in 2012, we started working and having a relationship with THET, the Tropical Health and Education Trust, who we love. And they received funding from DFID under their Health Partnership Scheme. And we were awarded a major grant to run a 3-year volunteering programme. And that saw up to 6 medical volunteers at any given time in Kambia for up to 6 months. Again, teaching and training of local staff in Kambia. And then around about the same time, we got another grant, which was a paired institutional partnership, which supplemented the volunteering programme, and it was similar to the Health Links one. We had specialist teaching trips, usually consultant-led, running 2-week training projects on a specific topic in Kambia. So things were all going swimmingly, and then in 2014, Ebola came along. Can you put the next slide up, Freddie, please? So when Ebola happened, initially everything was just put on hold. We brought all our volunteers back, and it was a wait and see what's going to happen. And when it became clear that it wasn't going away anytime soon, all the projects were terminated. They were suspended before they were terminated, and any funds were repaid to the funders. So DFID money was repaid. Then volunteering became less popular as a model in international development, so that wasn't something we could easily start up again. We had a weaker link to our local NHS, and that was just through a change of personnel, new chief executive, and people had less time to commit to leading projects on our behalf. They're still very committed to supporting us and going to Kambia if we needed people, but they didn't have the time to actually manage and lead a project. Understandably, NHS staff quite pushed. And we had a change of trustees. We had some trustees that retired. We had some trustees that felt they wanted less of a hands-on approach. So we had some new trustees come on board. And it was a time really for us to reflect and sit down and think, where do we go from here? And that was when Jill came on board. Peter, one of our new trustees, he knew Jill and he knew she'd be ideal for this project for us. Now, I should say I've maybe painted a bleak picture, but this is up until, say, 2014-15. I would say 2016 is when we had the review. And since then, I mean, we're still going strong. We've still got great projects going on in Kambia. We've got a mentoring project that we're really very proud of. So things are still looking good. But it's just that was the situation leading up to our review. So I will now hand over to Jill, who will talk you through what she did and the process we went through.
Lovely, thank you, Shona. I've prepared a few slides today. How I'd like to do this, because I presume that most of you are here because you're interested in potentially doing your own strategic review, or perhaps updating something you already have. So I've prepared a few slides today which just talk through the process that we went through at the time. And so I'll give you a little bit of an overview, first of all, of the approach that we took. And then what I'll take you through is more of the detail around what we actually did. How you might start upon this journey, and what are the key steps that you need to go through and think about as you're developing your own strategy. So we'll just give Freddie a moment to get the slides up. Lovely.
Oh, sorry, I'm just getting the new one up.
Can you see me okay there? I think potentially that might be a little bit too high. Is that better?
Yes, that's great.
Lovely, thank you. So my name is Jill Bishat. I have a little personal services consulting business called May Buckley Consulting. And most of the work that I do is in corporate settings. I've been in strategic change for 30 odd years, which is quite a challenge given that I'm really only 23. But I've done this type of work through the world. I did a stint in the Middle East, and I've spent probably the last 15 years in the UK working with different sized organisations, really. I do quite a lot of strategic change. I help organisations work through their strategic approach. And I do quite a lot of board level facilitation as well. So it's all about that providing independent challenge, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So Freddie, if you could go to the next slide, and I'll just take you through the things that we're hoping to talk about today. So first of all, I'll give you some hints and tips around the approach and why we did it the way that we did it, and some of the tools that we utilised, which I selected based on what I was learning about the Board of Trustees, what their thinking was, what their experiences were, and I selected the tools that we could use that I felt would be best placed for them. We'll then talk a little bit about the benefits of taking a strategic approach and why we might want to do that. And then I'll take you through the process of how to develop one. And we will stop for some discussion as we go into the development phase. Because if you are interested in setting up your own, I think it's really, really important that we just get a gauge of where you are now, and then open up the floor to some discussion around, you know, what you found works so far, or what types of experiences that you've got. We'll then move through the rest of the process, I'll just give you a few of my top tips. And then at the end, we can use any time left for any questions that you might have. So if you think of something as we're going through, please pop it into the chat box and we can address that. Or at the end, if there's anything that comes through, we'll just have a discussion around that. Or if you want to talk through some ideas, if you've got something already and you'd like some feedback from the group about how best to take that forward, more than happy to use the time there. So let's move on to the next slide then and start looking at what type of approach did we take. So we're going to start at 12 o'clock and then we'll move clockwise around these 5 boxes. So essentially we did 5 workshops, 4 of which I think were sort of 2 or 3 weeks apart. And we utilised those really to try and get as many of the trustees together in the same space as we possibly could. As Shona said, there were some new trustees coming in. So what I wanted to make sure was that we got as much knowledge share from those who'd got the experiences of Kambia, and that everybody was hearing the same thing. Quite often when you have people who are in a position of experience, we make assumptions about what everybody knows, and we quite often assume ourselves, don't we, that because we know it or we think it or we feel it, that other people are in the same space. So it's really helpful just to go back to basics and share those experiences up front. So one of the things that I have to say is that Shona and Peter managed the logistics fantastically. They did a great job of getting as many of the trustees together as they could. We got everything into people's diaries and we had a fantastic venue for when we managed to get together. And that was really helpful because we based it on a flip chart type approach. I use graphical facilitation, so wherever I can, I put visuals, I draw pictures to try and appeal to different people's learning styles. So we were able to use the flip chart approach and pin things up around the room so that at all times we've got everything visible to everybody in the room, and we were able to draw on some of the experiences and some of the reflections that people had had in previous workshops. Those visual clues are a great reminder because I tend to work on an evidence base. And I think that's a really important point to note, that you will get a lot of people who have views and opinions, but actually if you can record the facts in a really honest, appraised way and keep referring back to them, it really gives you some good visual clues about how you're moving forward. And I think we utilise that to good advantage, really. I put facilitation is king, but as Peter and Shona will tell you, the secret to success is chocolate. Whatever else you do, put bowls of chocolate on the table and you're flying. That sugar rush just really helps people along the journey. What they probably didn't know is that during week 1, I watched everybody to see which chocolates and sweeties they took and which ones they left. So when I wanted to get people into syndicate groups, I actually purposely put different bowls of sweeties in front of people to make sure they sat where I wanted them to sit without having to tell them. So I should have put that in my top tips, but that's one of the sneaky things that I do. But seriously, with facilitation, I think it really helped the Kambia Appeal, because we know that you're all capable people and you can probably do all these great things for yourselves. But actually, by having somebody independent there, and particularly somebody who didn't know very much about the charity to start with, it gave me a sense of independent objectivity. I was only able to refer to things that were spoken in the room. I didn't have any background knowledge where I could call upon anything or assert anything. So that independence is kind of a critical friend, and it's quite helpful. We all know people who are extroverts and great talkers. So if you're thinking about launching into something like this, I'd recommend you tap one of those people up and just get them to just come and talk things through with you. It does give you a slightly different perspective. The challenge is key. Lovely people. I could not have worked with a lovelier board of trustees, but they're all lovely and nice to each other all of the time. So what I was able to do was to come in and provide a little bit of challenge. So everybody's very passionate. Everybody was really driven about taking this forward. And so I was just able, with my independent hat on, I was just able to come in and just say, well, hang on a minute. Last week you said this, a moment ago you said that. Those two things don't match. Tell us a little bit more, think a little bit more, tell me more about your thinking. And the other thing it allows you to do is it means that everybody that you've got in the room is able to then really focus upon contributing. If one of you tries to facilitate on behalf of the others, it means that you then don't get to contribute in the same way. So it puts everybody onto a level playing field and means that you've all got an equally valid voice. So I think that was quite important to the approach as well. And I think that's probably why Peter asked me to come in and help out. The power of three, the next eclipse, is a really important one for me. So what can quite often happen when you're going through your strategic thinking is that you get quite stuck in language. And it's very, very easy to spend a long time thinking about the words that you've used. Will they be meaningful to everybody? Perhaps that word's a little bit harsh. Perhaps everybody won't understand that. So one of the things that I was able to do was to move things along and say, don't worry about the language. Let's get the spirit, let's get the nature, let's get the feeling there so that we've got everybody on the same page, and then we can worry about how we word it afterwards. So appreciating that quite a lot of people work in a very reflective nature and they prefer to have time to think about things. By putting time in between the workshops, what it enabled us to do, it enabled the contribution on the day. We were then able to get the views of the people who couldn't attend. And it also gave everybody then the opportunity to reflect on what had been said, what the contribution from others was, and how do we pull that together and start to nurture that and drive that and then get agreement and get consensus in order to move forward. But as soon as we got that consensus, we didn't then spend time polishing it or working it through. We got the agreement to where we were and we moved on to the next stage. So that continual movement was really, really important, I think, to make sure that we kept on track and just kept everything moving through. The other thing was the teamwork. As I say, and I'll say 100 times over, this was a lovely group of people to work with. And I think what we were able to do through having these workshops and the face-to-face time was to really get a sense of team building in there as well. We'd got new people that were coming in, we'd got people who'd been there right since the beginning. And it was all about getting to know each other, understanding everybody's knowledge and skills and viewpoint, and really just that knowledge share, I think, was fantastic. And by doing it in a very open way, as we did, I think it helped to build a little bit of trust between everybody as well. Not saying that they wouldn't have trusted people beforehand, but I think it just moved it along a little bit quicker so that everybody was able to come together as a board of trustees quite quickly. And going through the process, I think what we started to see was when people started to give their contributions, we could really understand where people's preferences were, where their skill sets were, and what they were really, really passionate about. And that was really helpful for me then, as we were able to move forward and think about the different strategies, because it gave us clues all the way through as to who would be the best people to take on the objectives as we started to determine them. So getting people together, I know it's harder in the current climate, but that's just a really good way of really, really bonding that team and getting everybody moving forward. And the other thing that we adopted was not only using the visual clues, but we used a couple of tools that allowed us to go through the process and build on what we'd had the week before. That meant that as we came through and we started to build this approach, we could check it back. Did it tell us a story? And in a couple of minutes, I'll show you a couple of the tools that we used, and you can see how we built that story through the strategic approach. So in doing that, it ensured that we had the alignment, because we could then go back and say, oh, actually, you know, we said that this was what was complicating the business at the moment. Have we addressed that in going to the next stage? So it just gave us that opportunity to look back and say, does it make sense? Does it really tell a story? And with the tools and the framework, I use a very, very simple structure for my framework. We're going to have people in the room who have always got different levels of experience. And so to keep it as simple as we possibly can is always a great starting point. If you haven't done a strategy before and you're looking to do one, what you will find is that you will go through this first iteration and it will feel as though you've got that story and it's a great story to tell. But then as you start to plan and budget and manage the activity, the story starts to change slightly. So your strategy needs to be developed and you need to keep working with it so that it develops as your own story develops. And so one of the things that I'm really keen on personally is trying to get everything onto one page, because if it's one page, you can see it, it's easy to refer back to, and you can cart it around with you without having to go through lots of documentation. So overall, that was the type of approach that we took. We went through 5 workshops. The first 4 were to come up with the content. We then allowed a little bit of breathing and thinking time, and then we came together and set the objectives and the roles and responsibilities for how this strategy was actually going to be played out. And when we got to that 5th workshop, I felt at that time that actually the skills of the trustees were strong enough that I was then able to hand this back and say, right, it's over to you now. Really fortunate in the Kambia Appeal that they've got planning skills, they've got strategic skills, they've got great leadership skills and fantastic marketing skills. So with all of those things together, it meant that I really didn't need to do the guidance. I was just there to facilitate their thinking, to get them to the point where they could move forward together as a group and take these things on and take their objectives forward. But appreciating everybody is different and everybody needs a different level of support and involvement. So once again, we come back to that. Do you have somebody independent that could help you with this, that can really provide that objectivity, that can become your critical friend and just check back with? So that, I think, really kind of sums up the approach. Peter, Shona, is there anything that you'd like to add there in terms of the approach that we took?
No, I don't think. The only thing I would say is that as well as the trustees at that workshop, we had other sort of interested parties, didn't we? Other people that worked within the NHS, people who'd been to Kambia. So it wasn't just the trustees. And I think that was quite useful, wasn't it? Yes,
yeah, to get those different perspectives and those different viewpoints. Yeah, yeah, very good.
And the timescales, I think we were having workshops, the first batch of workshops were like sort of 2 or 3 weeks apart. And then the final one was like a few months, you know, after the last one. So that's how the timing worked.
But I didn't know about the sneaky chocolate trick.
I know, you see, when I come back to hold you to account, you'll know all my secrets now, won't you? Lovely, thank you. Does anybody have any questions so far? Or can we move on? Has anything come up?
I had one. Oh, shall I put it in the chat?
Oh, no, that's fine, Lucy, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The question was, sorry if I missed this in the introduction, but I was curious about whether there were a number of staff also employed by the organisation and if they fed into this process too, or if it was purely for trustees.
Shona, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. We don't have any paid employees, We do have a consultant that we use, and he was copied in on everything and was able to feed in, but we don't have any paid staff.
Got you, that's clear, thank you.
I mean, my recommendation would be that you get as many people involved in the process as you possibly can. So if you have got employees, if you've got partners that you work with on a regular basis, it's a really good idea to get some of those people in, you know, if not to the whole thing, at least just to part of it. So if we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to show you one of the one-pager tools that we used, and I will come back to it later on as we're going through the process. Now, don't worry about this being a very busy document, because this is actually, it's not the final version, but this is one of the draft versions that I thought I'd just put in there for you. And this is what I call the strategy house. And it helps us go through. So if you look at the top, there's the vision, there's the where do we want to get to? And then there's the mission, which is what are we here to do? And I'll talk about the differences in those two in a little while. One of the things that was really important to us was to really understand what the values were. So how were they going to make decisions and hold each other to account? And this for me is one of the critical elements of building your strategy, but it's actually one of the hardest points to get to. We'll talk a bit more about that in just a few moments. And you see where we have at the bottom, we have the next actions. I'll show you a blank version of this later on, which shows some of the focus areas. And as we were going through the process, I was recording some of the things that people were talking about. We must do this, we mustn't forget to do that. This is one of the things I'd really like to do. I was recording those as being focus areas. And then when it came to the point that we were in the last workshop and we were determining our strategic objectives, it just gave us a point of narrative to say, have we thought about all of these focus areas that we've talked about in going through the process? So if we move on to the next slide, please, Freddie, we'll just talk a little bit now, I think, around, I'll just show you briefly, actually, the communication tool. I may well come back to this later on, but this was something that I put together for everybody to use as a kind of a back pocket elevator pitch. So as we were going through, what I did was record what everybody felt was the current situation. Where are we in real time right now? And then the complication is something about, you know, what is proving difficult right now? Why are we not in a position of absolute strength? And we come to the governing thought, which is the part that's in larger text there. And that's really saying, we feel that if we are to be recognised, etc., 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 there are things that we need to do. And then we have these 4 focus areas here, which is our kind of cunning plan for how we move forward. But again, just by putting it into that one pager, it just gives you a little bit of a focus area and something to talk to other people about. So again, we'll talk about some of the tools later on, but that one is known as top-down thinking. It was created by a group called the McKinsey Group of Consultants, and typically we go through SCQA, the situation, the complication, what's the question that we're wanting to then answer in the objectives and the actions that we take forward. So that kind of concludes the little bit around the approach that we took. I think now I'd like to move on to just talking a little bit about why you need to take a strategic approach. So, Freddie, would you mind moving us on to the next slide? Lovely, thank you. So when you're developing your strategy or your forward plan, or however you want to describe it, but when we look to the future on where we want to go from here, it's really important that we take a simplistic view. We have to say, where are we now? And believe it or not, that's quite a challenge for people to articulate where we are in terms of the great stuff, because everybody wants to talk about the great stuff. But we also need to understand actually where do we potentially have some areas of development, or what are the environmental factors that might be causing a little bit of challenge. So that might be, if you've got a large number of organisations in your particular area, and that's causing a little bit of competition because people don't support as much as we'd like them to. That might be an area that we need to talk about as well. So it's taking that real-time approach to understand exactly where we are now and to be able to articulate the business that we're in. So what makes us different to everybody else? What is our unique selling point or that point of difference between us and everybody else? And it's really important to get that mapped out. We then need to be able to give a consistent view of where we want to get to. And when you're thinking strategically, you're thinking about your midterm plan, so maybe 3 to 5 years out. Now, you could argue that there's so much change going on in the world at the moment that it's really, really challenging to think about 3 or 5 years. But if I were to say to you, if you take the approach of thinking, we need to dream big, and we need to think about, if we had no constraints, what would our world look like? And I think to be able to have that shared view across your entire group is really, really valuable. And once you've got that shared view, it then makes it much easier for you to be able to articulate that, whether it's with your sponsors, your fundraisers, your partnership organisations, your employees. If you can all talk about exactly the same picture that you're trying to build in the future, that gives you a really strong leadership position. It gives a really strong framework to navigate through. So once again, if you are determining some shorter term projects, can you reference where in your strategy they are going to give you the benefit? And if you can't, that gives you the opportunity to question, why are you doing this? And are you actually getting the most out of your money? So it just gives you that framework with which to check back to make sure that the projects that you're engaged in at the moment are the right kind of projects. And if a risk or an issue comes in which blocks you or stops you from going where you were wanting to go, you can look back at your strategy and say, well, that's still where we want to get to. So actually, let's just have a regroup and think about what alternative route might we take to actually get there. As I mentioned, it provides this narrative so that you're giving out the same message with all of your shareholders. And I think that's really valuable. If you're able to articulate in a very strong way, it really gives people confidence. And I think that really helps with the whole funding and sponsorship situation, certainly. I mean, it's quite true, isn't it? If we think about ourselves, the sorts of people who inspire us are those people that dream big and have that strong vision and know exactly where they're trying to get to. It inspires a level of confidence. And that supports effective decision making as well. So again, once we've got our strategy in the page, we can then look back at that and say, oh, right, let's just check back and make sure that everything that we're doing is putting us in the right direction to achieve that ultimate goal. It also gives you the opportunity to say, when you're setting budgets, when you're thinking about your projects, are they all contributing in the right way? And the final thing is about driving that strong leadership, ownership and motivation. If you've got a single message and you've engaged everybody in building that message, they will own that and they will want to help you drive forward your objectives and achieve what you want to achieve, which in turn gives the ability for strong leadership when you've got a motivated team that you're working with. So I think they're just some of the component parts of why you might want to take a more strategic approach. And most of us tend to work in the tactical. So we tend to think about, you know, the next few weeks, the next few months, the next year. So actually to have had somebody else do that thinking for the longer term just frees up our brain a little bit to then to be able to focus really on the shorter term plan and how we get there and how we take those can't even say it, those incremental steps to being able to achieving the big objectives. Freddie, can you move us on to the next page, please? Thank you. So let's get a little bit into the process. So I see really that we have got these sort of 6 big steps, and 1, 2, and 5 are those 3 key areas that I've just talked about. How do we get that position of where we are now? What's our vision, mission, and values? And we're going to have a chat about that in just a moment. And then what's our action plan? How are we actually going to get there? So if we start with the first box, where are we now? As I mentioned, this one can be a little bit challenging because everybody can be quite optimistic and we all like to say nice things. And we don't like to admit really that there are potentially areas where we could grow and develop. So again, this comes down to if we can get everybody into a room and get everybody's perspective, it really allows us to grow from that basis of evidence. So if you're thinking about embarking upon having a strategy, talking to your shareholders, talking to the partners that you're working with, as Shona said, they brought some of the people into the room, into the discussion, or they reviewed the documentation that was being put forward. You then get all sorts of perspectives, which gives you a really, really clear view. When I went into this, I just asked the question. I said, as somebody who's not been involved, tell me about yourselves, tell me the background of the organisation, and tell me where you think that you are now in terms of achievability and the ability to move forward. And I just recorded all of that information as we went through in workshop 1. I then paused it at that point and we moved on to vision, mission and values. So this is helping us to identify where do we want to get to? And in doing so, what are we here to achieve? So what's the gap between where we are now and where we want to get to in the future? Freddie, can you move us on to the next slide for a moment? And we'll come back to this because what I want to do is to just pause for a second, and I'd like to just do a quick poll and just ask you whether you have a vision, a mission, or any values. Do you have any of those stated? Freddie, can I hand over to you now to run that quick poll for us?
Yeah, so I'll launch it now. There's just yes or no answer to the question that's shown. So it should be up now.
Presume you don't want us to take part.
Well, it'd be really interesting, wouldn't it? Have you got a valid vision and mission? Has everybody voted?
We've got 8 people who voted so far. Hope everyone can see it. Give it a couple more seconds.
I'm not voting since I'm part of the Kambia Appeal.
Right, has everybody had the opportunity? Can we see?
Okay.
Can we see the people? How are we doing? Have we got more people that have one or not?
No, we're at 8, but yeah, maybe that's as many people as can engage.
And what's the output?
I'll just end the poll now. So we had 7 to yes and 1 to no. So that's 88% on yes, 13% no.
Fantastic. So 7. That's really great. That 88% with the vision and mission. That's fantastic. So for those of you who do have a vision and a mission, would you be happy to share with us how you use them or what you use them for? Would anybody like to share?
I think there's a further question there as well as to how often they update them. Is this something you need to update every 5 years, or should be part of your plan?
Mm. Yeah.
So coming to Richard, Shona and Peter then, having done this a few years ago, what's your view on when it should be updated? Is yours still valid, or do you feel that yours is ready for a refresh?
I think it's still valid, but I think it would be good to revisit it and see how we're measuring up against it. Definitely. I think it's been useful for us, to clarify our thinking, and you can measure where you're going against it in terms of, you've clarified what you want to try and achieve going forward. But I would say very useful to revisit, and if necessary, change, because things do change, obviously. So 5 years ago it's very different to what you could be now. So I would definitely recommend that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Also, so I've just missed that message. So Claire, you revisit yours every year. Do you find that you make many changes to it, or has it remained fairly consistent for you?
During the sort of, we've revised them quite significantly twice. So so it's a bit of tweaking. And one time we revised, we actually did change with the Charity Commission, sort of changed wording as well. So for our sort of charitable purposes.
Right. So can I ask, while you're still on the line, Claire, what do you use your vision and mission for? Is it a communication tool? Is it something that you use with your board?
Yeah, it's communication, and we also, quite a lot of our donors ask what our vision, mission are, and it sort of forms the basis of our framework for the website and our out-facing sort of marketing and comms. Yeah, and it's been very much developed with the trustees.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful, lovely. Thank you for contributing. For those of you that don't have a vision and a mission, would anybody be prepared to share what you use as your communication tool, with your stakeholders? Does anybody have anything else that they use?
There's also a question in the chat I can see from Violet that I'll answer either at the end or now, whenever's convenient.
Yeah, we haven't got anybody come forward on the nose. So do you want to take that now, Shona?
Yeah, okay. So Violet was asking, how did you include the voices of the people in Sierra Leone? And I think that this The exercise that we went through with you, Jill, I think it was really for us, the UK end, we're a little bit adrift in terms of clarifying our thinking and looking at our people and where we went from here. But in terms of the people in Sierra Leone, we have always prided ourselves, I suppose, on being driven by them and their needs. So we have quite regular consultations with the people in Kambia to make sure that we're all going in the same direction. So that particular exercise that you ran for us, we didn't include them because I think it was for us, we needed that help. But we've always had consultations with them to say, well, what do you need? How can we help? What are your priorities? So I hope that helps.
Lovely, thank you, Shona. Right, okay, well, let's get back onto the process then. So Freddie, would you mind going back a slide, and we'll go back to the 6 points to go through. So when we think about where we are now, this really has to be that honest appraisal of where are we now, what's been successful, what potentially might not have been as successful as we would have liked, and actually, do we have any development areas? Now, one of the tools that I quite often use for this is the SWOT tool. I'm sure many of you have come across this in the past, but that really is the conclusion of the where are we now. So if we can get the views from as many stakeholders as possible to feed into that, that's fantastic. There are some tools out there to help with that. There's something called the business model canvas. There are some other tools which allow you to go out to different stakeholders. There are some questioning techniques that you can find on the web to help get some feedback. And then we move into this SWOT. Now, I think we did this round about the third workshop that we had. We used the first one to talk about where are we now. We then went on to the vision, the mission and the values. And then we went through this SWOT analysis. And what the SWOT does is it helps you to identify where your strengths are. And that strength not only in organisation, but thinking about where you are economically, where you are in terms of skills, in terms of the people that you work with, and your funding and financing positions, and your marketing positions as well. So it's a rounded appraisal. A number of tools that you can use in there, which I may well come on to later if we've got the time. If not, that might be a discussion for another day. But the SWOT really concludes all of that conversation together. And I've got box 3 as being a strategic analysis, because what I did after we'd done SWOT was I pulled together all of the information that we got from where do we think we are now, where's our vision and our mission and our values wanting to take us, and actually therefore where are we starting to see some of the gaps that we might need to address. So that's what really brings all of that together in quite a constructive way. When doing your strategic analysis, another tool that's quite helpful is Porter's 5 forces, and that talks about the 5 forces of strategy. One of the things that I didn't say in the approach was that actually I never talked about strategy, I never talked about tools, I never talked about any of the frameworks in any of the workshops. It was all about discussion, and I used these tools in the background to help me with that analysis against where we are now. So being able to look at where we were economically, what the market share was looking like, what the commercial arrangements were looking like, how this team were managing and wanted to forward manage and lead, and the growth aspect, because there's something about you can only grow with capacity to grow. You need to keep everything running at grassroots level. So is there really the capacity, or do you need more people, more funds, more resources available to you to help you move forward? So all of that I did in the background. But it's just a really nice thing to go through. The honest appraisal of where we are now, then the ambition, where are we trying to get to? And there again, you know, dream big. Think about, if we had no constraints, where would we like to get to? Then your strategic analysis. The most simple ones are the SWOT and Porter's 5 forces to help you get there. What we then went on to do was to set the strategic objectives. So if we can move on a couple of slides, Freddie, I think we'll try and get back. These next 2 slides, so the first one that Freddie's got here and another one, is just a tool that I used. I've put it in there really for you to reflect on at a later date if you're looking to start doing vision and mission statements. All I did at the time was a little bit of research around what were the current vision and mission statements from some of the top 30 not-for-profit organisations, and I just brought those together just to help the Kambia Appeal think about what other people were saying, just to help get that message into their minds. So that's just a bit of an aid memoir really for you. So if you move on to the slide after next, Freddie, then we come back to the strategy house. Next one. Oh, no, the value statements. Sorry, I'd forgotten I popped the value statements in there. Again, one of the things that I was trying to build in helping move forward with the values was to just get a number of statements together. And we had quite a lot of information come forward about what people felt were their values. And you normally start with things like honesty and integrity and doing the right thing and not pushing ourselves beyond our financial abilities. Those types of things come out. But again, when we're thinking about USP, what's unique to your situation? So these were some of the draft value statements that we pulled together that we then put into the strategy house. So we go to the next slide. This is the one that I'm looking for. So session 1 then, I was able to pull out the mission, which is the second box down. The second workshop that we did, I was able to pull through the vision. And then, as I say, we had those draft value statements where we just ask each other, how do we intend to hold each other to account? How are we going to make decisions? So that helps us understand what our governance structure needs to look like. But it also really gives that true picture of where do we feel we are and where do we want to hold each other to account and how do we want to work as a group. So the value statements we then developed through the weeks and they went into those individual boxes. And can you see at the bottom there's the focus areas. So this is what I was talking about earlier. Having done the strategic analysis, I will put some of the things into there, but also as we were going through the process of identifying what things are important to us, what we care about, what are the things that we must do, what mustn't we forget. They all went down into this focus area at the bottom. And then we pulled all of those focus areas together and we distilled them down into a set of strategic objectives. So I think at the time we came up with 4 or 5, and I think that probably feels like the right sort of number of objectives to have. One of the challenges that I'll talk about in a moment is that when you have a voluntary body particularly, people are really very optimistic and driven, and there is a danger that you can take on too much. So if we try and keep our objective to between 3 and 5, it feels like a healthy sort of number. 1, for us to be able to remember, but 2, we can then pin everything back to that smaller number of objectives. And in setting those objectives, we can use the SWOT. If you use any kind of risk-based profiling, if any of you have project managers, you will probably have some form of risk log, or you can look at something called PESTLE, which is a way of looking at risks from different viewpoints, different angles, and pull all of that information together to then build your objectives. Those objectives are meant to be quite high level. So they won't be specifically around what we're actually going to do. But that's about a large piece of work, and we will find that as we go into the forward plan or the action planning, what you usually do is you have a number of actions that will then all contribute into achieving that objective. So again, there's something that you need to think about when you're writing your objectives about how are we going to measure whether the things that we are doing are actually helping us towards achieving that strategic objective. And one of the things that we need to think about during that process is actually what are the roles of the people that you have. So it might be paid workers, it might be volunteers, it might be trustees, it might be partners. But once you've got your objectives and you know where you're trying to get to, it's much easier then to take a step back and say, so actually, what role does everybody take on so that we're not falling over each other? What skills do we have around us to be able to achieve those objectives? And you can then start to do some audits and some gap analysis work around. So if we know we want to achieve that objective, we're going to need somebody with a particular skill set. Do we have anybody on the team now who has that skill set? So a simple discussion will help you pull out where you think you are with that. And then you can identify any gaps. And then one of your focus areas that you move on to, or your immediate action plan, will include how do you either achieve that skill by building on the skills you've already got, or how do you get more people in that have that skill set already inbuilt. So once you've got it into this page, and I've put, you know, where some of the focus areas ought to be and some of the things that you could be thinking about in that space, just to help you along that journey. But once you've got it all onto one page like this, it's then really, really easy to run through and say, does it tell a story? What are we trying to achieve? Where are we trying to get to? How are we going to get there? Should then lead you to your action plan at the end. And that's really that third part of how we move forward. One of the things that I'm not going to cover off today, partly because it wasn't something that I worked with the Kambia Appeal on, because they had their own skills within the group to be able to do it. But, you know, one of the last things that we need to look at is the budgeting and the operational plans. So how do we move from having those strategic objectives into having a tactical action plan or a set of projects that will help us move forward? If any of you are going through the process at the moment or about to embark upon this, and you need a little bit of help in terms of how to move from your strategic objectives into your planning and your projects, don't hesitate to just drop me an email, because I've got a really nice little cheat sheet that I've put together for how you can articulate that and what sort of steps you need to get to in future. Okay. So if we can move on, please, Freddie, to the next slide. So this one I referred to earlier and was our top-down thinking. And this is just this storyboard that we put together. Now this is slightly different to what we have in the objectives, because the objectives are just that. They're something that help you with your decision making. And this type of communication tool just gives you a clue as to kind of how we're going to get there. So if we look at the first of the 4 A's, so where we've got governance, one of the things that was really important for the Kambia Appeal was to make sure that we had a roadmap and that we got a governance model that was in place that really, really helped understand how they would grow the roles and responsibilities of everybody that were involved in the process. So this kind of communication tool gives you a little bit more of the detail around some of those focus areas and some of the things that you might want to concentrate your effort on. And it also helps you do a top-down, bottom-up review of whether you're actually going in the right direction. If our situation at the top is our background and our honest appraisal of where we are now, and the complication tells us a little bit about what's challenging in the current situation, then we move down to say, these are the things that we've got to do. As we look across the actions, we can look at those and say, actually, if we were to do all of these things, would that give us that governing thought that we've got above it? And will that then address the complication of the situation that we find ourselves in? So this again is something that you should kind of update and move forward as you go through the process, as you learn more and you shift and develop your strategy. Also update those kind of real nuggets of information about how you're going to get there. That would be one of my areas of advice. So Freddie, if you could move on to the next slide, please. We're on to top tips, and really I've only got 3, so they should be fairly simple to remember. So the first one on the left is having that really simple process. Where are we now? Where are we trying to get to? How are we going to get there? If you can get somebody who knows nothing about your organisation, that gives you a really good feel for, are we saying the right things? Is it simple enough? Will other people outside understand where we're trying to get to? Get that honesty, get that stretch, get that challenge into your thinking. So really, really challenge each other to think about, have we got to the grassroots of exactly where we are and what our complication is? The next one, talking about being pragmatic and having a realistic approach. Again, my finding is that when I work with not-for-profit organisations, there's such optimism, there's such passion and drive to move things forward, to get to where we want to go. Sometimes being able to take a step back and saying, are we being realistic about what we can achieve? And have we got the right number of objectives? I think is absolutely key to you being able to move that forward. Last thing for me is really about making sure that everybody has the opportunity to contribute. And I've said all trustees, but really I mean all of your stakeholders. Make sure you've got that broad brush of everybody that you engage with, understanding how people see you, how they engage with you. Do they have the right level of information? Are they able to get their point or their challenges and issues across to you in an open and a pragmatic way? And I think if you can take on board all of those things, it leads to obtaining that really clear direction and the ability to plan effectively, so that you get to the real nub of what things do we need to do in the short term to achieve our long-term vision. Freddie, can you move to the next slide, please? So I really wanted to open it up to the floor. Are there any ideas that you'd like to talk about? Anything that you'd like to discuss with the group or get some input on? Or do we have any remaining questions that we can answer for you this afternoon? Unfortunately, I can't see whether there's anything in the chat. Could somebody just have a look and see whether we've already got some questions?
I think we've covered what was in the chat, but I was just wondering if I could ask a question about involving people in the process. Oh, something's just come through on the chat. I'll just finish my question. In a previous organisation that I worked, a small organisation, which didn't have any kind of strategy, we went through a process and we'd been advised about involving everyone, and we kind of went round and spoke to volunteers and spoke to staff and spoke to other people, but we didn't really know how to go about using what they'd given and at what point in the process we should have involved them, because it felt like they had some expectations about what we were going to do with their input, which then weren't translated into the strategy document. So I just wondered if you had any guidance on how you go about getting that involvement in the most kind of constructive way.
Yeah, so for me, there's a number of tools that you can use to do that online. But I think the first thing is really, it's about that expectation management. And if you have a very open discussion with people about, you know, you're refreshing where you want to get to in future, and ask them actually what would they like their level of involvement to be. So right from the beginning of the process, you know exactly what people are expecting from you. Sometimes when I'm in different situations, I will approach it in very different ways. So today we've been talking about how we approached it with the Kambia Appeal. But I have some organisations that I work with where we actually get everybody into a room right at the beginning, and I go through a process which allows us to talk through everything from where are we now, what are your views on how well or otherwise we're doing, what risks are we facing at the moment, what opportunities and threats do we see coming through, is there anybody else who isn't in the room that we need to engage with and get their views in. So if you think about all your stakeholders right up front as part of that change management process, and you actually just write a list of all of your stakeholders and just say, actually, how important is it to get their views? Do we want to consult with them in order to get their views to form part of it? Do we want to inform them of what we're doing to help them understand what we are doing, and that we will share the outputs with them? Or do we want to run some focus groups or just send out some newsletters to other groups of stakeholders? So one great change management tool that I quite often use is a stakeholder mapping process. And that's where you go through and you identify all of your stakeholders. You identify how important are they to the success of what you're trying to achieve, and what level of influence do they have. And then you can do a little audit to say, actually, what are the best mechanisms for communicating and contacting with that particular stakeholder or stakeholder groups. And that just gives you that real clarity up front about your own view of who you feel needs to be involved. And then go out and ask them. Most people are delighted to be asked to be involved in the process. And there may be some areas that you perhaps don't want to chat with them about. You might not want to air some dirty laundry, and that's fine. You just have a discussion amongst you beforehand about, are there any sensitive areas that we might not want to share with this particular group of people. But then be really, really clear about how important their view is to you, and make sure that you do embed that. So when you do your strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, you then put their views into that SWOT analysis. And by doing that, it shows that you've really taken on board the feedback that they've given you, which does make people in turn feel more valued and part of the process. Does that answer your question, Gemma?
Yes, thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat as well, so shall I?
Please, if you would.
Yep, so the first question from Lucy, did you also cover theory of change in the process? And then the second question also from Lucy, with the Kambia Appeal, acknowledging that trustees dedicated a lot of time to this process, what's your experience of doing similar work when people are very time poor?
Right, so the first question, let's go back to the first part of the question. Sorry, could you repeat it for me? That's quite a long question.
Oh, sorry, the first question, did you cover theory of change in the process with the Kambia Appeal?
What a great question. And, you know, I do this with different clients. So the theory of change and strategic change is something that I do cover with clients as and when I feel it's needed. So again, when I first go into a group, I will understand and get from them what is their experience of change, what is their knowledge of change, what change have they done before and how well has it been received. And from that, I will take a judgment as to what knowledge share to give them. But quite often I will do a whole session around the change management process. I will talk about how to communicate with different groups of people, the importance of senders and receivers, who sends messages, how people receive those messages. We'll talk about how people respond to change in very different ways and what impact that can have on your change journey. So yes, I do cover off all of those things, but it really does depend on the group that I'm working with. I was fortunate enough to have worked with Peter in the past, who is a very, very strong change manager, and he understands a lot of this. So I was confident that Peter could take that forward without me having to worry too much about the change side. And the second part of the question, in terms of how you engage with people when they're very time poor, again, that's a great question, but I think it depends what you're trying to get out of it. When you review your strategy, why are you reviewing it? Are you reviewing it because it's a little bit out of date? Are you reviewing it because there's been some change in the environment? Or have you had internal change? And I think depending on where you're coming from will determine how much time you actually need to have face-to-face. How much of a knowledge share do you need amongst your group of stakeholders? And if you need to do it where you don't have a lot of time with people, then I would recommend doing it on an individual basis. Think about the questions that you need to ask or you need to get to the bottom of. And you can go as simple as, where are we now? What's complicating? Where do we want to get to? And what's their view on how we get there, on what risks and issues we face? Do it independently. You could even do it as a questionnaire in the first instance. So it's only going to take people 10, 15 minutes to engage with. And once you've got that initial picture, you can build something from it, and then send it out to people and get people to engage more collaboratively at that point. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions for today? No, sounds like we've exhausted the questions. Would you mind just putting up the final slide for me, Freddie? Lovely. So if you walk away and perhaps I haven't given you enough information, or there are some specific points that that you could do with a little bit of help on, please don't hesitate to give me a shout. My number and my email are on the bottom of this slide pack. So feel free to get in touch. I'm more than happy to have a chat with you. I am working in a commercial environment at the moment, so it might take me a day or two to get back to you, but don't worry, I will most certainly come back to you. So I think that all that leaves me to say is just thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for investing the time to come and have some dialogue with us and understand the process that we went through with the Kambia Appeal. Thank you, Shona and Peter, for inviting me today. And as I say, if there's anything further that I can do to help or answer your queries, please don't hesitate to drop me a line.
Thank you, Jill.
Yes, thank you very much, Jill, and Shona and Peter for organising today. It's really interesting. I think it's really helpful to have some practical experience and have some tips to take away, because the strategic review and development piece can be quite overwhelming, and there's a lot of theory behind it, and it's really useful to hear a worked example and to think about practical application of that. And particularly for our organisation, because we're due to go through this process next year when our strategy ends. So now I know how to judiciously use chocolates on the table to facilitate this process. So thank you very much for that. Just a very, very quick update on the next Small NGO event. We're looking at how, as a committee, the group can play a more active role in representing small NGOs across the advocacy work that Bond are doing. And we'll be holding an event at the end of November, and there will be information posted in the group about that, but please do get in touch. I think that's everything for today. So thank you again for everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next event. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you.